Hello and welcome to episode 175 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Derek.
And thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips as possible. So if this is your first episode, please do go and check out our past episodes. We've had some brilliant guests on and I'm sure there'll be someone that you want to hear from, just like this week's guest.
Yes, indeed. This week we're chatting with the wonderful Sunyi Dean. Her debut novel was The Book Eaters, which received rave reviews and was on the bestseller lists, which is always very nice to hear. And of course, she is also the co-host of the Publishing Rodeo Podcast, which is a podcast which kind of dives deep into the publishing industry and dispels some of the myths about what people perhaps don't know about the realities of getting your book published.
Yeah, exactly. So once you've listened to our podcast every week, and I stress that only once you've done that, you should go and listen to the Publishing Rodeo Podcast, because seriously, it is a really great podcast and it does really delve, pull the curtain back, I guess, on what really happens even after you've got a book deal and that sort of thing. So it's a really informative and entertaining podcast.
It is, and it tackles those questions like finances, the stuff that people are maybe... all those questions you wanted to know but never asked, whatever the phrase is, like, finances, advances, the reality of having a career.
What happens when you're a middle-list author,
exactly,
and all that sort of stuff.
Marketing.
So, it's a really great chat we have. So we'll get straight into after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer?
Absolutely not. I think I was probably one of those people who didn't want to be a writer. I would still describe myself as a reader because I read a lot more than I write. And I think I had this idea when I was about 11 or 12 that writing would be like a really cool occupation, and that I was probably the only person who'd ever had this brilliant genius idea. And then I think by the time I was 13 and on the fan fiction Wheel of Time websites and every other person wanted to be a writer, I was kind of getting the idea that this is like a pipe dream and everyone wants to do it and hardly anyone makes it. I think by then Google was pretty effective, and I did some quick Google searches on how to become a writer and was like, okay, this is not a good road.
So, I mean, having had that initial desire to do it and then sort of being put off by Google, what was it that sort of drew you back into it then?
Probably, at the risk of sounding cliche, not being a success in anything else. I think, if I had had any other kind of career or anything in my life that panned out the way I planned, I would not have done writing. But I guess I kind of reached about 29 or 30, had a little bit of a midlife crisis that nothing was kind of going the way I'd planned in my life. And I still hadn't written that book. And I just felt like at a certain point, I wanted to like do it almost as a bucket list to say that I'd done it. I'd written a book and given it a try. So I gave myself 2 years, which at the time I thought 2 years is loads of time. You know, if you can't get a book published in 2 years, you're never going to, which obviously we know is ludicrous. But I gave myself 2 years to try and get something published. And at the end of the 2 years, I hadn't done it. But by then, I'd already invested so much time and knew more about the industry and still wanted to pursue it. So,
and I mean, I take it even before this 2 year period, you know, the last like 15 years or so up to that point, I take it you'd always been thinking about writing, or it'd been present in the back of your mind, the kind of nagging thought that you should give it a go. Was that always sitting with you?
I think I always saw it as unattainable. And then this sounds really weird, but after I had kids, so I didn't use pushchairs or strollers for my kids because we had really very little money. I carried them in baby slings, and I ended up going down this rabbit hole of researching baby slings and fabric and weaves and looms. Like, did you know that you can make fabric out of milk, for example? Anyway, and in 4 months, I knew so much about that. I was like, I could have become almost like a sling consultant. I was this close to buying a loom. And I think at one point I pulled back and I thought, if I'd spent all this time trying to learn about writing, how far would I have gotten? And it just made me reevaluate like how I was kind of spending my time, and whether or not the barriers I saw between myself and writing were actually there, or just kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And so with that first book that you'd written, you went through the querying process. How did that go, and how many agents did you send that one out to before you thought, right, I need to move on to the next one?
About 130 queries for that book, which was at the time pretty much every sci-fi and fantasy agent I could find for adult fiction, really scraping the barrel, and some small presses too. I think I submitted to the Angry Robot Open Door and a few other places, and it was not, no one was interested because it just wasn't. I think weirdly, I did get one. I had Storm Constantine, if you know who she is. Mm-hmm. And she wrote back, and she did actually really like it. And she said, but I can't publish it. And she forwarded on to Ian Waitley at Newcon Press. And he said he'd take a look, and then he ghosted me, which is fine because it was a really bad book. And that's the closest I got to anywhere with it. And I'm glad it didn't get published, because it would have. I don't write epic fantasy anymore. So
yeah, I mean, you say it's fine. Obviously, you're happy in terms of your career, in terms of it not being picked up at that point, but ghosting is a real issue in the industry, isn't it? And whether it's agents, whether it's publishers, it can be very frustrating, especially for those that don't have a foot in the door yet. It can sometimes be quite a dispiriting thing to happen to you, and it happens a lot, I think.
It does, yeah. And I remember so the second book I wrote, Found an Agent, we went on submission, and that book died. It didn't sell. But one of the places we submitted to was a publisher where the editor said she was taking it to acquisitions, and then we didn't hear from her again. And when my agent nudged, she ignored it. And not only did she ghost us, she ghosted my agent on all my agent's other submissions. So,
oh my God.
So not only did she rejected me so hard that she rejected all of my agents.
It's your fault.
It just seems like such a strange response. I mean, I kind of get it why an agent does it to people, because they're overwhelming numbers or whatever. And I don't agree with it, but I understand why it happens. I don't get it at all when it comes to publishers and agents, because surely that relationship is so important that's the lifeblood for a publisher, is agents giving them work, and without agents, they'd have nothing there. And it's the small book world, etc. It seems a very strange, aggressive or passive-aggressive response to take.
Yeah, I think I've read somewhere there was an editor, I can't remember which podcast because I've listened to so many, but there was an editor that talked about it, and that she said for her it was like an anxiety response where so British publishers tend to feel okay with just sending one sentence rejections, apparently, but like US publishers want to give like a reason. And then if they don't have the time or mental energy to write a page, they keep putting off, and then it's been months, and then they just feel embarrassed, so they just they ghost completely. But to me, that's not really a satisfactory answer if that is what's happening.
No.
Learn to send one sentence responses would be my comeback there.
It's better for some sort of closure. It's better to know one way or the other than always.
It's not for me. Didn't make it through acquisitions. Didn't have the team support. I'm sorry. That's it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's chat about as you said, your second book was the one that went out on submission. And before we chat about that process, what was the difference you think between your first and second book? Because as you said, you submitted it to 160 agents, your book one. And like I read on your website, book two was like you got an agent in 12 days.
Yeah.
Book two, which is just, insane. Talk about opposites between submissions. Yeah. What was the difference between those two books?
Man, I feel bad saying this. This will sound horrible, but basically the first book I wrote, like there were things I liked about it, but by the time I finished the querying process, I'd come to the understanding that it wasn't commercial and that I was trying to learn what commercial was. And I felt very mercenary about it, but I feel like the first book you have to get published is often your most commercial. And then you can start being weird, kind of like Jeff Vandermeer, the later he gets into his career, the stranger his books become in a wonderful way. And I kind of set out to try and learn what a commercial book was. So I did try and write one. And it didn't really turn out the way I was expecting. But, I made some decisions I thought would help with that because I know that my books can go a little strange. Like I wrote in first person to try and be in deeper point of view, throwing out omni and having a contemporary setting so I could do less world building, focus on the characters and things like that. And I think that did help. And it because the first book I tried to write, it was secondary world at 5 points of view. It had like 4 storylines. It was way too much for a first book, and I needed something. There were too many areas to work on. So the second one I did have a better sense of like not writing to market, but beginning to understand what I guess a commercial book looked like, and just trying to learn that. And it did kind of work, and that it had agent interest, but only one offer in the end.
Did the first book get many full requests?
And none had no requests at all. Okay.
Yeah, because I suppose that's the thing is that thinking about whether it needs to be commercial and all of this sort of stuff, but you do only have that small amount of pages to catch an agent's attention, so those have to be in some way, as you say, perhaps more of a hook than your second, third, fourth published book necessarily need to be, because it needs to catch the agent's attention from the get-go, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a weird one because I think actually, because agents read so much more than editors, I think they do tend to gravitate towards the faster-paced books just because that's what stands out to them. My limited experience as editors is they're a little more patient because they read a lot, but not as many as agents. Like they're reading maybe 300 manuscripts a year compared to 3,000 to 6,000 that they're looking at for pitches. So sometimes you will go on sub. Once you have an agent, you can go on sub with a book that you'd never have queried because people will give you more time. Like they'll give you more consideration because you've already got an agent. They'll assume it's been kind of vetted and stuff. So I do think that first hurdle, it is a lot to clear and it does really help, but it's very hard to get through that door.
Yeah. And sorry, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, and obviously with the I think it was the third novel that you'd written, The Book Eaters, success. So you sort of made this steady progression of no requests, then representation, but not getting there, and then The Book Eaters obviously does get picked up. In terms of before we discuss that book, in terms of the process, did you get a sense early on that there was going to be more success with the queries for that one?
I felt like it would either do really well or completely not sell at all, and that the line between those two states was very hard to be sure of. I feel like there's like the line between doing well and not selling is actually really thin. That there's sometimes the slightest bit of difference between this is too weird to sell and this is interesting and different, if that makes sense. And I think you could look at some books like Neil Gaiman or whatever and look at his novels and go, oh, if there are a few things in this that were different, it wouldn't be as good. And I guess he makes all those kinds of right choices with the help of his editors. I don't know if that makes sense as a concept, but yeah, I felt like if I could nail it right, it would do okay. I did make some choices that were maybe less wise. My agent did say at the time, part of why Anchor didn't sell is we were getting lots of, urban fantasy's dead, you can't sell urban fantasy kind of rejections from editors. And that if I wrote another contemporary fantasy, it would be another difficult sell. And I felt like that wasn't correct. I know I feel like things go in cycles, yes, but that contemporary fantasy, like Neil Gaiman, Claire North stuff, it always comes back round eventually. And I felt like if I could do it well enough, it would be okay. So I think that's where you have to make, those choices between, you want something to be commercial, but you also have to write something you enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, that's certainly something we've heard from people, from publishers and stuff that we've had on the podcast, which is about kind of authors should have in their mind where it might sit in a shelf or something, when they're writing, like how would this be marketed? What genre would it fall in? What's this kind of tagline, perhaps? Or because the easier a sell it is, I guess, for our publisher's point of view, the more chances it is of getting picked up by them. And is that something which you would recommend authors should have? It shouldn't be the be all and end all, shouldn't chase trends, etc., but have an idea of the wider market and where your book might sit on that shelf.
I think it helps, yeah. And I think as well, so someone once long ago gave me this advice that you should write what's in your heart, but with your practical hat on. And I think for me, that's a good medium. And for book eaters, I felt like I had this theory that structure is what makes a book commercial, and that you can have whatever concepts you like and can be conceptually weird as long as the structure kind of it is accessible to readers. And that was essentially what I was trying to see if I could do with book eaters, is have weird ideas but a thriller structure, and I think it worked.
Yeah, I think it does. And how quickly did it, or what was the process from your editors, your agent submitting it to it getting picked up and published? How did that go?
Well, I'll explain the Anchor one for a basis of comparison. So Anchor, we first went out on sub and started getting rejections about the 2 or 3 month mark, which is about how long it usually takes for people to read and come back to you. And I think the rest of the rejections trickled in between 6 months and 18 months. So it took about 18 months for us to declare the book really dead on sub. But I think by 9 months, I was kind of feeling like this book's not going to happen. For book eaters, I was expecting a similar time frame. I think before COVID, I would have said like 6 to 12 months on submission for adult sci-fi and fantasy. And I was sort of settling in for the long wait. And my agent submitted on the Monday, and Friday morning we had an offer of preempt.
Wow. Yeah.
That's
from which I was not expecting. So that was completely insane. And that's not the shortest story I've heard, but it is one of the shorter ones.
And is there any, in your head, is there any rhyme or reason why that one happened so quickly when the other one sort of died on submission?
Partly it was timing. I think COVID had just hit, and it was right. COVID made things slower overall, but in the initial days, like everything ground to a halt. And I think at the time we submitted, my editor was basically at home with nothing to read because all her authors were delayed and stuff. And then this manuscript arrived from an agent she liked, and she was already keen on the idea, and she'd already seen the soft pitch on Twitter. So she read it very quickly and was able to get friends and family who weren't working from COVID to read it very quickly, and same for the team. So it just kind of did the rounds really fast. And I think my agent was confident in the way she pitched it when we went out and stuff like that. So just luck is always a factor for timing. Definitely.
And what impact did that success have on your writing? How did that feed back in terms of, I guess, the more knowledge you have of how the process works, does that make a difference in terms of the type of book you write? Knowing what gets picked up, did you feel that you were writing in a different way, knowing what you knew afterwards?
Yeah, you do. I think especially because my contract was for 3 standalones, which is a whole thing in itself. And that means that publishers are looking for more of the same, but not too similar, but not too different. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard line to walk. And there were a lot of conversations with my editor following that year over the next book about what makes a book more or less genre. And I think, Tor was looking for something that could be cross-genre again, because mainstream is where all the big readers are. And some of the conversations I liked less than others. I mean, one of the things Tor said early on is, "Oh, you've written a fantasy book for people who hate fantasy," and I have to say that kind of stung a bit because I want to write fantasy for people who like fantasy. But I understood what they meant. That the kind of person who goes, "Oh, I wouldn't read dragons," and they'll pick up like Emily St. John Mandel, even though they'd hate sci-fi, and you're kind of like, "That's a sci-fi book." But yeah, so that's the kind of thing they were looking for. We had long discussions about how the more world building you have in a novel, the more you shut out mainstream readers, and where that line is and where you draw it, and how you still express the story you want with those considerations. So it does have an impact, and it's why I'm glad my first book wasn't picked up, because I think if you get picked up when you're very young and you don't learn to find your own voice before you have corporate voices standing at your shoulder, it's probably very tough to do that second book.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those listeners that haven't read The Book Eaters, do you want to just tell us briefly what it's about?
I always really struggle with this. I used to say it was about two women traveling slowly on a train to Scotland. My editor said that's a bad pitch. So I guess it's kind of like a weird story in two parts. On the one hand, it is a story about society, people who eat books, and it has this kind of theme about how what we eat affects us, because everything they eat they remember and they're impacted by psychologically. But on the other side, it's a story about Devon and her son is a little different. He eats minds, not books, and every person he eats, he absorbs their personality and memories. So when Devon is trying to keep him alive, she has to find good people for him to eat so he doesn't become a bad person. Meanwhile, she's kind of on the run from her family, and there's lots of things going on. So it sounds completely nuts. Which is why I think actually all the back of book blurbs stray away from talking about the plot, because it might actually put people off. And it made sense when I was very, very tired and writing it, very tired and burnt out, and then I had to edit it into shape later. So,
well, let's chat a little bit about that kind of process.
Okay.
You know, what is your process? Do you plan a lot of stuff out? Do you pants it? Do you sit down and have like a routine, like a 9 to 5? What's your process?
I never have had routines or written every day, because that was impossible around special needs kids. I know that's the advice, is to write every day, but I think that comes from a place of telling people just to basically form it as a habit. And I don't have a problem finishing books. So for me, that was just pressure on myself to write every day, because some days you're just really tired. You need to go to bed. Process, I don't talk about much because I always sound insane when I do. So you can cut this bit if it sounds crazy. But no, sorry, it does sound nuts. And I've only ever explained it to Scott Aressa, and it's why I don't talk about craft a lot, because I don't understand my process very well. When I was in the process of getting a diagnosis for autism, one of the things that made me realize I need to look into it is I read an article from a woman who talked about how autistic people often experience something called a head controller, which is like a part of themselves that's always cold, disconnected, and watching. Like if you imagine your body's a mech and there's like a little man inside who is watching everything and observing everything and very detached. And that really shocked me, because I didn't realize other people experience that head controller thing until I read that article. And in relation to writing for me feels like a co-writing, a collaborative process between me and head controller, where like if I'm stuck in a problem, I will basically like do the mental equivalent of passing head controller. No, it's like, I need you to solve this and go to bed. And then I wake up in the morning, and oftentimes like there'll be a complete idea ready that's there. And I don't understand. I know that sounds mad. I don't understand my process very well. But yeah, I don't know. I sometimes plan, I sometimes pants. Every book is different. Book Eater required a lot of plotting, a lot of, I guess, because it had a lot of timing things going on, day by day, hour by hour, two timelines converging. Anchor was completely, that was the one before, it was completely pants. This one has been a mix. The one I'm doing at the moment, it's whatever. It changes book by book.
And in terms of your writing, or your drafting rather, do you come out with a fairly clean first draft, or is there a lot of rewriting before you're submitting it to people?
I'm a bit, I think, infamous among my friends for rewriting. Everything changes: plots, characters, timeline, settings. wild sweeping changes draft to draft. Definitely not a clean drafter. I don't know if you've talked to Richard Swan, but he's very much, he sits at the start and he gets to the end and his book is done, and I can't do that.
How do you know when you're done then? If your changes are so sweeping and stuff, how do you know when you think, okay, no more changes needed? Is it a case of running out of time, or do you know when it's ready?
I'm usually chasing an emotional state that I want to describe, and the story for me is just the vehicle for that. So I will change anything in the world, like I'll move from post-apocalyptic to fantasy, like male main character to female, whatever, kind of move time zone or whatever, just to get that emotional arc right. I guess for me, the story is about communication almost. I don't know if I'm explaining that well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in terms of, you say what you said about a routine and things like that, has that been more difficult then since you've got the contract where you now have a timeline, I guess, or a deadline when you have to submit books, whereas before you obviously didn't have that. Has that been helpful or not helpful at all in having that deadline?
So I think this is publisher by publisher. Some publishers, I don't know if I can say which ones. Well, I guess I will, but so Orbit has more strict deadlines, I've been told by Orbit authors, and they're a bit more like they really want you to meet them. Tor is very, very flexible. They're not bothered. You hand in the book when you hand it in. The deadline mainly that I feel is the pressure to earn more money. So obviously the faster I write, the sooner I'll get the next check. I do feel that, yeah, but then this book has just taken forever, and it is what it is.
And your website, I have to say, is really fantastic, and it's got loads of really useful advice, I think, for writers out there, including what I found the most interesting was just you kind of chart your own journey to publication, what you found and what you had to overcome, and I wondered, is it important to you to dispel some of the myths around publishing and to help others, and to because a lot of it is so unknown when you're starting out.
I think it is helpful, because when I was querying, I kept finding podcasts or articles or just stories where people would be like, I don't know if you've ever read Bernard Cornwell's story about how he got agented.
No, I've not seen that one.
It was in The Guardian, and basically he went to a party in New York while very drunk, and he begged an agent repeatedly to take his manuscript. And after the 7th time, when he got on his knees, the agent was like, "Oh my God, I will read it just if you leave me alone." And then 2 weeks later, they sold it for a shed load of money, and he was really famous.
That's the key.
And I was like, oh my. But you read stories like that, and that's not helpful. Or, J.K. Rowling and her one agent rejection, which is like, I can't even. And yeah, I think there are a lot of stories where it makes it sound like you either need connections or to win a lottery. And I think that's not really reflective. There are loads of people out there that do the query grind and do the submission grind and eventually get there. And I think the culture around talking about it is changing, and there's a lot more people discussing their journeys more openly.
Yeah, and obviously you have in fact started your own podcast, Publishing Rodeo, which has been a big hit, I think, in the publishing. Well, certainly for writers in the publishing industry. I mean, was that on the basis of the same sort of thing, that you wanted people to hear, the ups and downs of the publishing industry, even as a published writer as well?
I think so, because there was one point, I think in 2021, I was listening to hundreds of hours of podcasts, and I was struggling to find people talk about the business side a lot. And if they did talk about it, it was kind of, I guess, glossed over a little bit, which makes sense. People don't want to talk about the difficult sides of it, but it was driving me mad that we weren't having these conversations public. And I know you guys are in a Discord as well. So my Discord group, a lot of what we have on Pub Rodeo is the conversations we were having in private. And Scott and I just started having them publicly, basically, and just having, this open discussion and comparison between me and him, and having the same genre and publisher and all that, but very different debut experiences. I think if we'd known that our editors were going to listen to it, we would not have been so gung-ho about it, but that's water under the bridge.
Well, I was going to say, it has been, certainly in the writer circles that we're in, which, I'm not sure how big that is, but it's certainly made a big impact. And I wondered, on the wider publishing industry, has it made an impact? Have you had feedback from the publishing side of the industry?
My editor said, "We're not mad at you. So I was like, okay. They didn't mention Scott. I think they were a little cranky at Scott, but he'll probably be okay. I mean, his attitude is they don't pay me enough to care, so yeah.
I mean, I think there is something, especially in Britain, I think about talking about money and income, and I remember it was a Twitter thread, and it wasn't even that long ago. It was like a year or two max, I think. And people were talking about
what publishing paid me.
Publishing paid, yeah. And it was like what advances they got and stuff. And it was the first time I'd actually seen that conversation in the open, and which is crazy when you think about it, because it's such an important part of the job, and yet no one really talks about it, or they're scared to talk about it, or it's embarrassing, but it was such a nice thing because it suddenly leveled everything. You kind of realised actually there's loads of folk who are getting barely anything, or some random folk who get loads, and there wasn't any. It was difficult to see rhyme or reason sometimes, and it really kickstarted this whole debate, I think, which has just been a really good thing in the large scheme of things. Talking about it more is only a good thing.
Yeah, I think not talking about it benefits publishers rather than us, and I think it is helpful and useful to discuss it, because it's crazy that people don't know what they can make. And I think that there's tons of things where I think people do have the assumption that there's progression in publishing, that, you can start out like in any job, entry level, and work your way up. And that doesn't tend to happen. And, often the way you start is the way you'll continue. And often your second book deal is less than your first, which is something that shocks a lot of people. But that's more commonly the case. If you get a book deal that's the same size as your previous one, that's rare. Mm-hmm. Which is a little depressing. And technically that means it's less because inflation, but anyway.
And it's just one of the many issues that I suppose that people don't talk about, apart from on things like your podcast and a bit on ours as well. Decisions that writers have to make about their careers, because it is a career, or if not everyone wants to make it their career, but a lot of writers want to make it their career, and there are difficult decisions that will come up. Things like, if you've got an agent, a lot of people think, oh, I've got my agent. Great. Next step, publish next step, and they think it is, like you said, this sort of train line that they've stepped onto the train and they'll slowly start speeding up. But sometimes they'll have to change that agent because the agent's not very good and things like that. So, it certainly feels to us, I think, that it's good to have this sort of open discussion about these things and open people's eyes to it, because I think for a long time the publishing industry has been very opaque, and there's a lot of gatekeepers in the industry as well, that sort of, if you're new and trying to break in, it can be very difficult to know what's going to happen or what to do.
Yeah, it absolutely can. I think one person I found was a light for me early on was Cameron Hurley, who she was one of the first people I was reading who's really, really open about her publishing journey and how little money she made or didn't make. And she even posts like yearly summaries of her salary on her blog every year. And I think Michael Mamai does that as well. They both post how much money they're making in publishing. And I think in Cameron Hurley's case, the majority of her income actually comes from Patreon, which is life on the mid-list. You do need kind of multiple streams of money, not always directly from your books. Yeah. And even at my end, like, it took me ages to get sales data and to figure out how I was doing, how my books had done. You'd be surprised at how little editors know. Well, they don't necessarily know.
I mean, that's a good question, because a good point, because it's not just you don't know much as you go in, but even once you're in, you don't know much sometimes, because you get told twice a year by a lot of publishers what your sales have been, and and I've read so many stories about folk who have had books out for 2-3 months, and people are saying, how's the book going, and you're like, I don't know, I don't know what the sales are yet, which I find just insane. It's really crazy.
Yeah, the best you can do is kind of look at Goodreads and maybe get a vague idea, but even that's not very useful. That's very limited. If you write kidlit, Goodreads is useless.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's scary. Like, you spend those few months waiting to find out how you've done, and it's, you've no idea really for absolutely ages.
Yeah, I suppose unless you're on like the Sunday Times top 10 or whatever, unless you've done amazingly well, you probably don't know. You could be.
Even then, you'd be amazed how many books hit Sunday Times and then sell like pants afterwards, because
Oh, really?
I think the Sunday Times can be orchestrated. Yeah. There have been a couple of fantasy debuts in recent years that hit Sunday Times, and I know that their sales otherwise have bombed, particularly in other countries. So it really.
So why is that then? Why? I mean, I would have thought that would be a real good shot in the arm for it. But does it drop once it drops off that top 10? Is it hard to get visibility?
Well, I mean, firstly, it depends what time of year you hit Sunday Times. So if I debuted a week earlier, I would have been number one instead of number two. If I debuted 2 weeks later, I wouldn't have been on the list at all.
Okay.
Because the 2 weeks later was when you get all the people like Stephen King, Richard Osmond, and like Richard Osmond in September, his book, 127,000 copies in the first week, right? Like the lowest person on that list only sold 20K. But then there's weeks where you only need like 1,200 sales to scrape on. So it really varies. And it shows initial bookseller support, but if readers aren't picking it up, or if you don't get crate support, or if just other things don't work out, there's so many variables, so many tiny things. In the States, like if a book gets picked for, a B&N pick of the month, that elevates it. If it doesn't, you might lose out. There's so many little points where a couple of decisions can go one way or the other and have a massive impact.
Yeah, and even things like, books are only, they can be fancy and new and everyone can be buzzing about them, but within a space of about literally 6 weeks, sometimes they won't be in the bookshops anymore because they're not the new book, and the bookshop just doesn't have space for them, so they're gone, and because there's new books coming out, which seems ridiculous, but it is just a case that there's so many hurdles for writers these days. And it's funny because there is still this attitude, if you speak to someone that doesn't know about the industry, that if you're a writer, then you must be making lots of money.
Stephen King makes millions, so
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, my jiu-jitsu instructor asked me how much authors make, and I told him the average professional author in this country makes $7,000 a year, and he said, "Do you mean 70?" I said, "No, we wish it was 70."
Well, I mean, speaking of more books, Sea Sisters is your second book. Am I right in saying you've put out a couple of shorter stories? Is that right? In between.
Yeah, I used to write short fiction just because it kept something on the submission cycle, and now I submit to Tor.com because I got tired of being rejected. And I don't write very many short stories, like maybe one every year or so. So that's about right for them. Sea Sisters, just because I had to name the file something. I don't actually know what the book will be titled when it comes out, but it's a very different book. It was basically after I signed the contract, my editor said, she challenged me to think of something completely new and different, and just to see what I could come up with, and this book was a result of that. So it's like a historical fantasy set in World War II Hong Kong, kind of between the walled city and the outlying islands, which people don't necessarily know a lot about because they're very rural. And it's kind of a ghost story, I guess, a little bit Chinese Gothic.
Awesome. And is that due out next year then?
Probably not, because I've taken so long to write it that I'd have to be doing the final hand in now if it were going to come out in 2024. My guess is it'll be 2025 in spring. Just my suspicion, but yeah.
Cool. How are you finding the writing process? Do you find it gets easier with each book, or do you hit the same kind of hurdles, the same wall, the same self-doubt, etc.?
I think Gene Wolfe used to have this great saying about the only thing that writing a book teaches you to do is how to write the book you've just written, and that's that's my experience. Yeah. Because they're so different every time, and the experience of trying to write this one was atrocious. It's just I couldn't write until debut season was over, and there was loads of, you feel the pressure for it. You're being asked to write a bestseller when you don't know if your first book is a bestseller or not yet, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Which is like the worst. Sorry, that sounds horrible, but that is kind of what it feels like.
You said it was a 3-book deal, I think, that you got initially. Have you even thought about book 3 yet? Do you have ideas, or do you wait until this one's completely out of the way before you start thinking about that?
I do, but I do have ideas. I don't know yet what my editors will think of it, because they are kind of the final arbiters on it. So we'll see what they think of it. I do actually have, weirdly, book 3 is mostly written.
Okay, cool.
It would need to be revised, but for various reasons, it's not coming before this other one.
Where do you get your ideas from? Is it cliche question, but is it a case of looking at newspaper headlines, or do you just kind of, do things pop in there?
Just all, I think, yeah, all over the place. I think for book eaters, that the very initial spark was someone on Twitter saying that vampires had had their day and there was absolutely no way to do them in a way that's fresh or interesting. And I thought, oh, that's rubbish. And then I started thinking about ways you could do them and what interested me about them. I think for Sea Sister, that was almost just drafting idea after idea after idea and mixing things together. Which is not how I would normally do it. And I think for the next one, it was inspired almost by music, certain emotions that you think about, or certain concepts that just kind of develop. I don't know.
What was the last book that you read?
Well, I'm currently reading this one now, which is an arc. It's called The Book of Doors.
Oh,
and
I've
yes,
seen
that is a
yeah.
hardback arc.
I've seen.
It blew my
wow,
mind.
I've not seen a hardback arc. I've seen that book with doing the rounds on Twitter though.
Yeah.
Looks very nice. Yeah, this is an audio podcast, so people can't see it, but it looks
It's just
very
going to
nice.
be us going, wow, look at that book.
Yeah. For people who can't see it, obviously you guys can, but it's an arc which is in hardback with gold paint, and it's embossed, which I've never seen before. I can only assume this book sold for 7 figures. You got that kind of art.
Yeah,
that's
well, just saying,
arc.
it's quite good so far. I do like it, and I understand it has a sort of Matt Haig kind of feel to it. I feel like,
cool.
if that's useful.
Do you, when you get sent, or once you're published, you get sent lots of arcs and things. Do you feel under pressure to read all of these and give quotes and things like that? How is that a pressure in itself?
I think I did initially. I think it was just like the first few times people are asking you to blurb, it feels really cool. Like you become a cool person now. And then you start getting requests for stuff that's just like, there have been some I turned down. I think, like, I don't really like romance or steamy books. There's nothing wrong with them. I'm probably what people would call arrow in today's language. So when Harper sent some of those, and I said I would skip all the romance in this book, which is like 80% of it. So not for me, thanks. It would feel disingenuous to blurb it. So yeah, I do turn stuff down, and sometimes it's time. I think there was one editor who sent me a book and was like, could you read this and blurb it in a week? And I was like, no. and then so things like that, I guess. But you get, I think they get a better sense. It's like agents. Editors start to get a sense of what you like, and they try and send you things they hope you like. So
what about the last film that you watched?
Film. I think the last film I watched at the cinemas was the D&D film, which really was quite good, and I thought it would be really bad. Because the first one was unspeakable.
Yeah, the first one was awful, but no, I enjoyed it.
The one, the years ago one, like,
with Jeremy Irons.
Jeremy Irons, that's right. I never saw it, but I remember thinking it looked dreadful.
It was very stupid, but it worked, and it was really funny at the right moments. And things like, I thought the tiefling would be annoying because they usually are, and she wasn't. And I forgave the frigid wife trope because they used it well. And the bit in the graveyard really did remind me of like when you're playing D&D. And you just keep rolling like ass, and the DM keeps punishing you for it. So it's just lots of things. Yeah, how they presented the magic, the really fat dragon. I love fat dragons. They're adorable. So
I haven't seen it yet, but this does sound good. I think I will have to watch it.
I think it's a lot of fun, and TV wise, probably Severance this year was a good one. Severance and For All Mankind.
Yeah, those are one of my two favorite shows as well. I have to say those.
That's got to be one of the slowest burn shows on TV at the moment. All Mankind, but in a good way.
Yeah. It was when he shows it. I remember it kind of started off, and I was like, I don't know where they take it from here. What's the mileage? And then they just continually prove me wrong by being like, okay, actually, there's actually loads you can see.
And they allow it to develop very, very slowly, and that there's callbacks. So you do feel like you know these people in their lives, and it's good. I mean, you don't see a lot of shows on that time scale, so I appreciated the slower pace.
Yeah, it makes me really wish we were actually on Mars, etc. But well, the very, very final thing we do is a super quick fire either or, and obviously there's no right answer here apart from perhaps one of them. But we'll start off with TV or cinema.
I would have said cinema at one point, but probably TV now. Longer
Night
stories.
night owl or early bird?
Both. I don't sleep a great deal.
Fair enough.
Music or no music when you're writing?
No music. Yeah.
A fancy restaurant or a takeaway?
That depends how tired I am, I think. I do love nice restaurants, but sometimes takeaway is exactly what you want. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
If you combine it with the For All Mankind, it's a recipe.
Takeaway
in TV.
Yeah.
And the very last one, real book or ebook?
Oh, these days probably real books, because if it's on my ebook, it's easy to forget about it and just not read it. And if it's on a pile by my bed, I feel really guilty, so I read it.
Fair enough.
They need to start sending ARCs out as ebooks as well, or rather than the physical copies, perhaps.
Yeah, well, they do them, and I used to always take ARCs as ebooks because I thought it's more environmentally friendly. But publishers format their e-ARCs so badly that it's honestly a chore to read them.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you don't get the massive hardback tome.
Yeah, the gold.
Like the Book of
gold.
Doors.
Yeah. Well, this one, because it's coming from the UK, I thought, well, the postage isn't too bad. I feel terrible when they send it from like New York or something. But from here, it's like, that's only from London. It's all right. The planet will cope. And it's a nice book, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is.
Well, thanks very much to Sunyi for coming on. I thought that was a really interesting chat there. And,
Yeah, great.
the model for any writer in terms of like persistence and showing what you have to be willing to go through in terms of rejections and stuff like that to then hopefully land a successful deal. I think she said 130 queries for that first book before she gave up, and then the second book picked up very quickly by an agent, but even that then failed on submission as well. So it is just, I mean, we've talked about this before a lot on the podcast, but rejection, as painful as it can be, is sadly just a part of this industry. And you kind of just have to find a way to deal with that, I guess.
Yeah, I genuinely think that that a lot of the authors who don't get their books out there are the ones that just stop trying, to get out. I think if you are persistent enough and you get it in front of enough people and you keep writing books,
as long as you're not absolutely terrible or something,
as long as and you are half good,
yeah, exactly.
You will get better with every book you write.
Yeah,
you will
that's true.
get in front of more people. You'll be able to go back to those people again with a different book, with an improved book. And it's all just that timing. The more you submit, the more chance you have of getting that right place, right time.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's a numbers game, and it's, I mean, as Sunyi's told us, it's persistence is the name of the game. Definitely.
And also, what was really interesting was talking about the idea that in many other industries, there's this idea of progression, that you might start at a lower level, you might not get as paid as well, but if you stick it out, if you work hard, then you'll slowly progress up that ladder. But clearly, in terms of publishing, that isn't always the case, sadly. You could get a very small deal to begin with, and then that can set the pattern for the rest of the deals that you're going to get in terms of in the future. Or alternatively, you could get a very big deal at first, but your book doesn't sell well, and then suddenly you're not getting any deals, or you're getting very low deals. So it's a very fickle industry. But yeah, as we said at the start, if you want to hear more about that, then we would recommend listening to the Publishing Rodeo podcast as well. But yes, make it a double bill with the Page One podcast every week. I think that's what you need to do. But yeah, thanks for Sunyi coming on to the podcast. We look forward to the new book, whether it's called Sea Sister or something else, when it comes out. Hopefully, I think she thought early 2025. So yeah, we look forward to that one when it comes out. But next week, we've got another great guest.
Next week, we are chatting with the amazing R.J. Barker. Critically acclaimed and award-winning author of fantasy fiction, including the Wounded Kingdom trilogy and the award-winning Tide Child trilogy, whose new book is The Gods of the Weirdwood. Yeah, and we this is an episode that we recorded in front of a live studio audience, as they say on American sitcoms.
at Chimera back in July. It was a really fun chat with RJ, and because it was a live one, a bit of a different energy. RJ's a lot of fun to chat with.
He's great. And some audience questions as well.
Yeah, exactly. So long as they recorded and have not actually listened to the recording yet. But
there may not be any questions.
It's a fun episode. So please do tune in for that one. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please do take the time to give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whatever your favorite podcast app is, as that helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast. And please tell all your writing friends about this podcast. If they don't know about it already as well, get them to subscribe.
And of course, if you want to get in touch with us, you can always reach us by sending us an email to podcast@rightgear.co.uk, or you can reach us across every single social media platform going by searching for @UKPage1, unless you are on Mastodon, in which case you need to go to bear with me here, writing.exchange/@page1pod.
We're on every social media platform. Have you started the TikTok channel? Have you been doing dances every week?
I've been doing TikTok dances for years now, Mark. I've got 0 followers.
I'm off to go and look at those videos right now. But otherwise, have a great week, and we'll speak to you next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.